Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles individuals who are passionate about what they do for a living, about what organization they belong to, or simply passionate about the community they are a part of. Hello there and welcome. My name is Dave Cunningham. And before we start, let me wish you and yours all the best for 2021. Bill Fitsell passed away in December. He was 97. Many remember him as a consummate newspaperman. His People column was required reading for many Kingstonians, but it was his passion for the history of hockey that impressed many not only in the city, but around the world. Much has been written about Bill since his passing, and I wanted to add to those tributes by asking Mark Potter to sit down for a conversation and help us profile his longtime friend and mentor, Bill Fitsell. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Dave. Glad to join you today.
It's been a long time since you and I had a conversation.
It has. I started my radio career, and you were already very much into yours back at CFMK 96.3, and that was back in, late 70s, early 80s for me.
Oh, yeah. We are here today to talk about Bill Fitsell, who passed away in December, and we are going to explore many different facets of his life. And I think what I'd like to do is have you give us a brief description of what Bill was passionate about, and then we'll talk in more detail.
Well, to begin with, he was a great friend. He was just such a gentleman and just such a kind man, and tremendous respect for him. He was a great mentor to me, and you know, his loss is very personal for me and certainly for the hockey community, not just here in Kingston, but the broader hockey community well outside of this area. But Bill had a tremendous passion for hockey history and great curiosity, as any newspaper man needs, and he always had that. But I think he was really more interested in the early roots of hockey and how hockey really began. And the Hockey Hall of Fame here in Kingston, as part of the Kingston Winter Carnival, as it was known back in 1969, we started a historic hockey series, which was a recreation of the first hockey games played on the Kingston Harbor back in the 1800s. And Bill was doing some research into that, just trying to find out more about the early games in Kingston and beyond that, the earlier games that were played elsewhere. And he really made it a lifelong quest to try to research that and to find out, you know, the very essence and the roots of the game. And I can tell you that, you know, he uncovered a lot of the research that exists today, and that's going to be a tremendous legacy for him. Nobody has done more work in that area than Bill Fitsell, and he really became, not just in Canada, but really internationally, he became the go-to guy to talk about how hockey started. And actually, back in 2006, one of the 4 hockey books that he had written was a book called How Hockey Happened, and it really is kind of the definitive story. It goes right back to the stick and ball games that were played in Europe well before the 1800s, and he traces it right there to, you know, how it came to Canada, how it got to Kingston, Halifax, Montreal, etc. So he had a thirst to know the roots of the game, and he uncovered so many hidden gems which will live on for generations to come.
Now, let's go back to Bill's history, his personal history. Now, he was born in Barrie, but he grew up in Lindsay, Ontario. And as a guy, I'm talking about myself here, never played ice hockey, played my share of road hockey games when I was a kid, but never got on the ice. But Bill seemed to have lived the quintessential Canadian winter story when it comes to playing hockey. Why don't you go back and tell us a little bit about his love of hockey and how that all began?
Well, he arrived in Lindsay, which is up in the Peterborough area, as a pretty young boy back in the late 20s into the early 30s. And, you know, the NHL just came into existence in 1917. But the house he lived in Lindsay was interesting because his family actually had a double lot. So in the summertime, the one lot was used as a garden. And of course, in the winter, his dad would freeze the ice surface. And like a lot of Canadian kids, especially when we had harsher weather than we seem to have in our current winters nowadays. But he would spend, most of his hours after school and on the weekends skating. He had a great love for the Toronto Maple Leafs right from the beginning almost. And of course, the Leafs weren't formed until 1927. So he was about 4 years old at that time. And he loved Charlie Conacher, who was one of the famous Conacher brothers, and he was a great Maple Leaf, and a little bit later Sil Apps. So you're right. It was really, the typical Canadian boy, Canadian winter, and he had a great love of the game from early on. Like a lot of us, I don't think he was really much of a hockey player. I mean, he didn't take his hockey career too far in terms of competitively, but certainly loved the game. And as we just touched on, I think his great love of the history of the hockey sport came a little bit later.
Now, his dad was a Brit and was a baker by profession, but didn't play hockey. But he was out there every night watering that ice.
Yes, he was. Yeah, which is interesting, right? So apparently, yes, his dad was not a hockey player, didn't really skate. But of course, back in those days too, with the advent of radio and Foster Hewitt, who was calling the Maple Leaf games, and during that era, on a Saturday night, that was pretty special, and people would gather around their big radio in the living room, and as you and I both know from our radio careers, Dave, I always call it theater of the mind, but you could just imagine, as he was sitting here listening to Foster Hewitt call those Leaf games, wondering what was Maple Leaf Gardens really like. And actually at a fairly young age, I think he was about 12, he made his first trip to Maple Leaf Gardens with his dad and got to see the Leafs live and in person. And in fact, at one point, the Leafs actually came into Lindsay and played a preseason exhibition game. And he was able to get most of the autographs of the Leaf players. And certainly when they're on the radio every Saturday with Foster Hewitt, to have them come right to your hometown was a pretty big thrill. But, we used to tease each other because I grew up as an ardent Montreal Canadiens fan, and Bill, of course, knew that. And, we used to kind of have a little bit of back and forth because he was such a Leaf fan, and that rivalry was so great and still is.
One of the things I noticed when I was doing a little bit of research for our conversation today, and that's the fact that, and I think it was at the Leaf game that he went to with his dad, is that there was a fight that broke out in one corner of the ice, and there were flyers that went everywhere, and he sort of left his seat to gather up those flyers, which seemed to me to be a bit of a precursor to his desire to start to pull together little bits and pieces of information that he got really passionate about much later on.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. And Bill, of course, had told that story many times over the years. So it was actually one of the game programs that he picked up. And those are nice souvenirs to have, especially when you look back at the lineup, all those years later. And believe me, Bill was a bit of a pack rat. And I know along the way that he gave some of his research items to the archives at Queen's University, and also some to our Hockey Hall of Fame here in Kingston, because he was a guy that didn't throw much out. And I'm sure from 1935, he hung on to that program from his very first Leaf game, and things like that were very, very special to him. But you're right, that was probably the early beginnings of him being a collector of hockey artifacts and memorabilia, but more importantly, chasing down the history of the sport.
When he grew up, he got involved with the Navy Reserve out in British Columbia, and then joined the reserve full-time as a member of the crew of HMCS Outremont, and got involved in World War II. Can you give us some detail on that?
Well, interesting enough, at age 17, so he left his hometown in Lindsay, Ontario, and of course he was not alone. During the war years, many people did that. But when you think about it, really having spent his entire first 17 years of his life pretty much in Lindsay, even to travel to British Columbia, I would think would have been a bit of an adventure back in those days, and certainly, probably a pretty big challenge for a 17-year-old kid. And as you said, he did join the Naval Reserve and was stationed in British Columbia, and eventually was a full-time reservist. And as you said, wound up on one of the frigate ships that was involved actually on D-Day. I mean, obviously they weren't right in the heat of the battle, but they were in that area offering some backup protection to the Allied forces. And his role in the Navy, really on the ship, interestingly enough, when you look at his future journalism career, was he was kind of the record keeper, and he would keep track of things on the ship and events that occurred, and other notes, with the operations of the ship itself. And yeah, he was stationed there right basically till the end of World War II, and then ultimately wound up meeting his wife, Barbara. And in fact, just in October of this year, they celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary, which is pretty remarkable. But the one thing I will say, Dave, about Bill, and I think this is pretty common, especially among those who did serve, is that he never talked about it. Like he never ever discussed it. He never brought it up. I remember several years ago, actually, in the Wake Standard, they did a profile on him, highlighting his time during World War II. And I really knew nothing about that period of his life because, again, it was something he just didn't talk about. And I recall having some conversations with him about it. He always felt that he was pretty fortunate, as he used to say. All I did was take notes. I wasn't putting my life on the line, and I wasn't really in the heat of the battle. But, having just been in that area on D-Day, I'm sure that you're never 100% safe and secure.
Mm-hmm. We are talking about Bill Fitsell on our podcast today and his life and accomplishments. And back in 1945, he comes back from the military and musters out, and he meets his wife, Barbara, in Nova Scotia, and eventually has a family that included 5 daughters, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yes, Bill had 5 daughters, and, he used to always make the joke that if he had one more child, he would have had enough for a hockey team, so he was just a goalie short. And, I know he made the comment to me that, because, I know the girls played some sports, but I don't think hockey was the passion for any of them. And, I know Bill, certainly loves his daughters, and they're great people. And, but, Bill used to sometimes kid that, might have been nice if he had a son that played hockey too. But I know, they had a great family life growing up. And you also have to think about too, Dave, the fact that, he was a career newspaper man. And, as we know from our broadcasting days, working in the newspaper business, you don't take home a big paycheck every week. And again, it wasn't too uncommon, I guess, back in that era, to have 5 kids, but still, it's a big family to support. And I think Bill probably made a few sacrifices of his own along the way. One of which actually was, he never actually owned a car until he was in his 40s, in fact. So
I read that somewhere.
Yeah. So that part of that, I think, was probably financial. I think one of his daughters said that he seemed to be a little bit scared of automobiles or driving. But again, it's a little bit unusual to see someone that doesn't drive or own an automobile until they're into their 40s.
I read somewhere where he did not buy a car until he was 40 because as a reporter, he covered too many car accidents. And that sort of had an influence on his decision.
So, yeah, for sure.
So he becomes a reporter when he's in Lindsay. That's the career he chose to undertake. And he went to Port Perry after Lindsay, ended up at the Gananoque Reporter, and eventually at the Wake Standard. Correct?
That's right. Yeah, he certainly had an interesting career from that perspective. And, again, coming out of the Second World War, which, again, was fairly common in those days, he had no formal training or experience as a journalist, as we talked about when he was in the Navy. He was doing some writing and recording of notes and goings-ons that were happening on the ship at that point in time. So, and, obviously, I think he had a love of the written word, and it was something that he took to. And small town newspapers back in those days would certainly hire somebody, with passion and not with any experience. So you're right. Yeah, he made a few moves, but certainly his longest tenure was in Kingston, starting in about 1962 with the Wake Standard. He worked there well into the early 1990s, I believe. Writing the People column for a period of time, but he was a district editor. In fact, even in his Whig days, for a number of years, he was still posted out of Gananoque and kind of covered sort of that Gananoque, Brockville area for the Whig Standard. But yeah, he had a very long tenure at the Whig, and I know that he was highly respected and admired by his colleagues there, including the publisher Michael Davies, who I think was a big fan of Bill's as well.
Before he moved to the Wake Standard in 1962, he was still in Gananoque in 1961, and there was a hockey tournament that took place in Gananoque that featured the soon-to-be superstar Bobby Orr. Can you tell us that story?
Well, it is quite a story because, of course, Bobby Orr was a kid from Parry Sound, and, his Parry Sound team was playing at a tournament in Gananoque, and some NHL scouts had gotten wind of Bobby Orr, and they went to Gananoque. And I guess originally when they were there, they actually were looking at a couple local Gananoque players, but they certainly knew of Bobby Orr because Bobby Orr was, at least 2 or 3 years younger than the bantam age players that he was playing with. So the scouts were in Gananoque. There was a bit of a buzz, around this tournament because, again, Gan had a couple players that were being scouted as well. And that was really when Bobby Orr rose to prominence. And ultimately, he was signed to a card by the Boston Bruins. And Ren Blair, who had a strong Kingston connection with the Kingston Frontenacs after that period of time, he was one of the Bruin scouts that was there. But Bill, being the intrepid reporter that he was, and of course he was in the Gananoque Bureau in 1961, and he'd heard about Bobby Orr, he made his way to the rink. And as it turned out, Bobby and some of his teammates headed off for lunch to what was called the Boston Cafe back in those days in Gananoque. So Bill headed over there with his camera, and actually the Perry Sound boys were having lunch with some of the Gananoque boys. And Bill snapped this photograph of Bobby Orr at the Boston Cafe in Gananoque. And it got to be really the only recorded image of the day that, quote unquote, Bobby Orr was discovered. And it's become quite a historical photograph. And in fact, Bobby Orr did a book a couple years ago, and he used the photograph in his own biography that he did. And of course, previous to that, he had signed a copy for Bill because Bill Fitsell had gotten a copy to Bobby, and Bobby personalized it for Bill, and Bill had that hanging in his home office. And I know Bill kind of treasured that moment, and it's kind of interesting that a man that spent most of his life trying to track down history actually made some history himself on that day in 1961.
1969, you alluded to it earlier, is when he really got going on doing the research. And that was as a result of a winter carnival looking for a breakdown of some of the rules of how the game was played many, many years ago. So he starts doing research. And I gather from some of the things that I've read is that research was something he loved doing.
Well, you had to love doing it, right? So, and I think we lose perspective now that we've got Google and the internet. And, when I did the book with Bill called Hockey's Hub, 3 Centuries of Hockey in Kingston, I got a bit of a taste of this because if you want to Google something, even trying to find a lot of things from the 80s and 90s is not easy to do. But you want to go back to the 1880s or the 1880s, and there's only one way to do it. I mean, you spend hours and hours in libraries, you look at microfiche, you go through old newspaper clippings, and really newspapers, are the book of record when it comes to that stuff. And I learned early on through Bill that it's a very lonely, tedious process. And you can sometimes dig for days just trying to verify a fact or two. So in 1969, when the Winter Carnival started, they wanted to do a reenactment game because we all knew that there had been some hockey played on the Kingston Harbor, as early as the 1840s, which was British soldiers, and then a bit more organized between Queens and RMC in the 1880s. And Bill went to work on that because several other cities, including Halifax, Windsor, Nova Scotia, Montreal, Ottawa, had laid claim to being the birthplace of hockey. But what Bill discovered was really the work had not been done. Like nobody had really put the work into it. And each of those cities tried to make claim that they were the birthplace of hockey, including Kingston. And Bill really started around that time, but I mean, it was not something that was done easily or quickly. Mm-hmm. He literally spent decades at it. And then ultimately, he founded what's called the Society for International Hockey Research, which is a pretty big deal. And he was the gentleman who got it going back in the early 90s. And many other like-minded historians did a lot of research on this. But Bill was really the front runner with the research that he had done. And ultimately, they wrote a special paper back about, I'm going to say 20 years ago. And ultimately, they decided that the first quote-unquote organized hockey game was played in Montreal in 1875, which was about 11 years before the Queen's RMC game on the Kingston Harbor. But you're right. It really was that Kingston Winter Carnival in 1969 that sparked his interest. And I will tell you, we've played it every single year since, with the exception of 2021 because of COVID. It's not going to happen. But that was one of Bill's favorite days of the year. I mean, he really was the heartbeat of historic hockey. There was no day he loved more than that. He was our official timekeeper, record keeper, and he kept all the records of all those games. And every year we invite down, Dave, the soldiers from CFB Petawawa. They represent the British military of that era, and then Queens and RMC. And, it's going to live on, hopefully, for decades to come, but it'll never be the same without Bill Fitsell there.
You've mentioned a couple of times of the book that you wrote with Bill, Hockey's Hub, if I remember the title of the book.
Yes, that's correct.
And I guess there's something that we should probably mention because it is a bit of a fun story. And that's the fact that when Bill started to do his research, the method that he chose to use was not his iPhone or his iPad to track all the information. He had index cards. And for those of you who may not be aware of what an index card is, it's a little, what is it, 5x7, if that?
Oh, smaller
Maybe even
than
a little
that,
smaller.
Yeah, 3x5 maybe.
3x5 card. And people would make notes on it, then file them in a box, typically is what would happen, or a drawer. And that was Bill's passion, another one of his passions, to keep track
funny.
of it that way.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny, too, because back in the day, of course, many women who in those days were at home, they would put their recipes on these index cards, right? So I used to joke with Bill that his wife, Barbara, must have had all her recipes memorized because he had every index card in the house. But what Bill would do, and he did this for years, he never went anywhere without a few index cards in his pocket and a pen. And every time he heard something interesting, some kind of hockey fact or anecdote, or when he was writing his People column, which was a very popular column in the Whig Standard, he would jot it down. And I can't tell you how many columns were produced from that. But with the book itself, so I kind of joke with Bill that really what we did was we took hundreds of his index cards and we turned it into a very popular coffee table style hockey book, which was called Hockey's Hub, 3 Centuries of Hockey in Kingston, which in fact sold 2,000 copies as a fundraiser for the Hockey Hall of Fame. And we were told at the time it was the best-selling locally published book in the history of Kingston, which we were both pretty proud of. And I always kind of looked at myself really with that book as being more of an editor and sort of the person that pushed Bill to write the book. I did a lot of the editing. I did some of the writing, but certainly, the research, especially going back to the 1800s, the research was definitely Bill's. And, it was really his material that brought that book together. But we had a lot of pictures in the book, and it was very well received by Kingston hockey fans.
You've mentioned a couple of times you've known Bill for 40 years. How did the two of you meet?
Well, when I was 20 years old, I became the TV sportscaster at CKWS, and I guess then and still today, I'm the youngest anchor man in the history of the station. And once I got involved with sports on television, there was a gentleman who ran the Hockey Hall of Fame here in Kingston. He was a retired railway man, and his name was Doug Nichols. And when I was a kid, I played hockey in the church league, and Doug Nichols was the president, and I went on to be a timekeeper and a rink rat. So Doug knew me. And he brought me into the Hockey Hall of Fame. And I always had a curiosity about the history of hockey in Kingston. And, basically from day one, when I got to be around the Hall of Fame as a young guy, I mean, at that time, Bill would have been, 57, 58 years old. And there was a lot of other gentlemen there who were 60-ish or more. And here I was, this 20-year-old buck, but I had a great passion for hockey history. And I think once they realized that I was sincere about that, that they really took to me. And I think it was a special kinship that really I had with Bill Fitsell, because we both shared the same passion, and he saw that I really cared about hockey in Kingston, and I really cared about the history, and we collaborated on so many projects. I mean, the book was the big one, but and Bill was really a driving force in the Hockey Hall of Fame from the 1960s right up until the last couple of years. Actually, like the workload that he did and what he did for that Hall of Fame will never be surpassed by anybody.
Hockey Hall of Fame is obviously a passion for you as well as it was for Bill. Tell us a little bit about the Hockey Hall of Fame and how it may differ from the other one.
Well, we're the original Hockey Hall of Fame, right? So the founder of the Hockey Hall of Fame, a gentleman by the name of Captain James T. Sutherland, who was a Kingston guy, he worked for decades to try to, first of all, get a Hall of Fame established, because he felt it was important that the greats of the game, not just the players, but the builders, would be recognized. And he felt that it should be in Kingston because Kingston was, in his view, the birthplace of hockey, although Bill Fitsell didn't share that opinion ultimately. So basically, Sutherland convinced the National Hockey League and the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association that Kingston was the birthplace, and the Hall of Fame should be here. Much like the Baseball Hall of Fame is in a small town in upstate New York called Cooperstown, the National Football Hall of Fame is in Canton, Ohio, where there's ties to the origins of the game in those small communities. So that's basically how it happened. And, we're very proud. The first 42 members that were inducted into the Hall of Fame were inducted during the Kingston era. Our Hall of Fame's been running continuously since 1943. It's a volunteer-run organization. It is the oldest Hockey Hall of Fame in the world, the oldest Sports Hall of Fame in Canada. And Bill Fitsell used to say it was a little hall that could, because obviously we don't have the budget the Hall in Toronto has. We don't have the support of the National Hockey League that the Hall of Fame in Toronto has. But our niche really is really about exploring, the early pioneers of the game, the roots of the game, and the Kingston greats, and there's many of them. And we really try to tell the Kingston story. These days we're located in the Invista Center. We used to be for years beside the Memorial Center property at York and Alfred Street. Of course, right now closed down because of COVID, but we hope to reopen sometime in 2021. And, Bill was extremely proud of the Hall of Fame, and I've been involved for 40 years. I stepped aside as president, but I'm still involved as a board member. And I think Bill always loved my genuine passion for the Hall, much like he had as well.
Let's talk about the series. We've alluded to them a couple of times during the course of our conversation, the Carr Harris Cup. Tell us who started, how that got started, and who's involved in it. And there's a story to tell about that.
Yes, there is. Yeah. So 1986 was the 100th anniversary of the first game in Kingston, which was 1886. So in 1986, the Hall of Fame here, we decided that we wanted to do some things to mark the occasion of the centennial anniversary of the first game in Kingston. We had a special 100 night downtown at Legion 560. We had Rocket Richard there. We honored who we felt were the top 100 people who had given the most to the game of hockey. And each of those individuals, some who had passed on at that time, were honored. But also that year, we decided that we needed to formalize the Queen's RMC game because it had been played continuously since 1886, the oldest rivalry in all of hockey. So we put up a challenge trophy, and the Carr Harris family, which actually is one family, it's a hyphenated name. Some people think it's two families, a Carr and a Harris, but it's one family, the Carr Harris family. So Bill decided that their name should go on the trophy because both those families had kids. They had parents that had gone to both schools, Queens and RMC, that had coached at both schools. And the Carr Harris family really embraced it. So it really was Bill's idea. Now, in the early years, it was quite a small event. Now these days, they're playing it in front of 4,000 fans at the Leon Center in downtown Kingston. But back in those days, we played at the RMC rink, the Constantine Arena, which is a bandbox over there. It only holds 300 or 400 people. And we played at the Memorial Center. So it was a pretty small time event. And also during those years, especially, the RMC hockey team was not very competitive. So one of the first Carr Harris Cup games, Queens won by a lot. I forget the score. It was like 9-2 or 11-1, something like that. And we've always had a tradition where we pick an MVP, most valuable player, from each team. And when a team loses that handily by such a lopsided margin, it's a pretty difficult task. So after the game, we go back to the officers' mess over at RMC, and we have a post-game reception and hand out the MVP awards. So we asked Bill to hand out the awards for Queens and RMC. And when it came time to hand out the award for RMC, much to my surprise, Bill said, "I'd like to acknowledge the trumpet player in the RMC band, because clearly he's the only cadet who can play." And this was right on RMC soil, right? So the Queens people thought it was quite funny. I thought it was hilarious. And RMC people probably not so much because they had the Commandant there and everybody else. But, Bill kind of had this dry or sneaky sense of humor. And it's funny because anytime I ever brought that story up, Bill would get a chuckle, but he was also somewhat embarrassed by it, I think, because he didn't want it to seem like he was, mocking the RMC team or making fun of them. He just said it in jest. And anybody that knows Bill, he didn't have a bad bone in his body, so he meant no harm by it. But in my books, still today, one of the funniest lines I've ever heard, Dave. I thought it was great.
I'm sure there are a lot of other stories that we could tell. And when I look at the clock, we've sort of reached the end of the run here. And I thought what would make sense is to read that quote, or maybe you have it memorized, that Stephen Smith made about Bill, and I don't know if you have it in front of you.
I don't actually have it right in front of me, but if you have it there, if you want to.
I have it. I think it's a good way to sort of wrap up the program to sort of wrap up who Bill was.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in hockey terms, his caliber might be best expressed in a Lady Byng Trophy context. His proficiency at what he does is only exceeded by his good grace and gentlemanly conduct.
Well, it certainly does sum up Bill Fitsell. And as I said off the top, Dave, what a kind, gentle man. The research that he has done, will live on for generations to come, and it's irreplaceable, really. And at 97 years old, I know his family, feels that, he led a very good life, which he did.
Mm-hmm.
He was only actually, in failing health the last couple of years. So he led a very good life. He was a great man, and as I said, he was a great friend and a great mentor to me. And I've not met a better man than Bill Fitsell, and really honored to come on here today and share some stories and some memories of my good friend Bill, who's gone and certainly will never be forgotten.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Dave.
Theme music for the program is Stasis Oasis, a tune written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of our episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast Facebook page. This is Dave Cunningham from Kingston, Ontario. Thank you for listening. Until next time.